The 1970s were a golden era for British cinema, yet behind the velvet curtains lay a scandalous secret known as the casting couch. While the public saw glamour and smiles, many aspiring starlets were forced to make difficult compromises behind closed doors to secure their place in the spotlight. Today, we reveal the stories of 10 actresses who allegedly advanced their careers through private arrangements with powerful producers. Was it ambition or survival? Subscribe to our channel now and let us know in the comments if you believe talent always shines through, or if connections matter more. Let us uncover the truth. Diana Dors. The incomparable Diana Dors remains the ultimate symbol of British glamour, often described as the answer to the blonde bombshells of Hollywood. Yet her path to stardom was paved with difficult choices and uncomfortable compromises. Throughout the 1970s, she was a beloved figure on television and in film, but behind the dazzling smile and the mink coats lay a history of exploitation that defined the industry during her rise. Diana herself became one of the first major stars to openly discuss the reality of the casting couch in her explosive memoirs released in the late 70s, shattering the illusion of innocence that surrounded the British film business. She described a world where powerful men viewed young actresses not as talent to be nurtured, but as commodities to be traded and consumed behind closed office doors. At the center of her most harrowing experiences was her first husband and manager, Dennis Hamilton, a man whose ambition for her career far outweighed his moral compass. It is widely documented that Hamilton orchestrated situations where Diana was expected to charm and entertain influential producers and financiers in private settings to secure funding for her films. These were not merely business dinners, but carefully engineered encounters where the line between professional obligation and personal intimacy was deliberately blurred. Hamilton understood that Diana's physical allure was their ticket to wealth, and he ruthlessly exploited this asset, often pushing her into the arms of men who held the keys to the studios. The industry in London during those decades was a closed shop run by a small circle of elite men who operated with total impunity, knowing that a young girl from Swindon had no power to refuse them. Diana recalled instances where auditions were held in private hotel suites rather than casting offices, with no script in sight, only an expectation of compliance. To refuse was to risk being blacklisted before one's career had even begun, a fear that kept many aspiring starlets silent for decades. For Diana, navigating this predatory landscape required a steely resilience, and she often had to play the role of the naive blonde while possessing a sharp and calculating mind to survive the sharks circling her. By the time the 1970s arrived, Diana had transformed from a vulnerable starlet into a matriarch of the industry. Yet the scars of those early years remained visible in her cynical wit and her eagerness to expose the truth. Her books, such as For Adults Only, detailed the sleazy underbelly of show business with shocking candor, naming no names but leaving little to the imagination regarding the price she had paid. She wrote of the gentlemen's agreements that took place in smoky clubs in Soho, where roles were promised in exchange for companionship that extended far beyond the dinner table. It was a transactional world where talent was secondary to one's willingness to participate in the game. The tragedy of Diana Dors was that she was a genuinely talented actress, capable of great dramatic depth, yet she was constantly pigeonholed by the very men who exploited her image. The roles she secured through these compromised connections often focused solely on her physical attributes, ignoring the sharp intellect that lay beneath. Even in the 1970s, as she took on more mature roles in comedies and dramas, the legacy of how she had been marketed by Hamilton and the studio bosses continued to haunt her public persona. She had played the game to win, but the victory came at a significant personal cost, leaving her with a lifetime of tumultuous relationships and a deep mistrust of the machinery of fame. Her story is a stark reminder that the glittering icons of the screen often carried heavy burdens, forced to trade pieces of their dignity to satisfy the gatekeepers of the cinema. Diana Dors survived the system and eventually controlled her own narrative, but she never let the public forget that the casting couch was a very real and ruthless piece of furniture in the offices of British producers. She paved the way for future generations by refusing to pretend that her ascent was purely a fairy tale, admitting that in the harsh light of the film industry, beauty was a currency that had to be spent wisely, even if the transaction left a bitter taste. Mary Millington. While the glitter of mainstream cinema attracted many, the story of Mary Millington stands as the most heartbreaking testament to how the British film industry of the 1970s devoured its brightest stars. She was often hailed as the only true sex symbol Britain produced during that decade, a woman of breathtaking beauty who became the face of the permissive society, yet her ascent was orchestrated almost entirely by men who viewed her as a lucrative asset rather than a human being. Unlike others who had to barter for roles with strangers, Mary was trapped in a complex web of professional and personal exploitation, where her managers and producers were often her lovers, making the casting couch not just a momentary hurdle, but a permanent lifestyle from which there was no escape. The tragedy of her career lies in the fact that her roles were inextricably linked to her willingness to perform, quite literally, for the pleasure of the male gaze. In the mid-70s, as she became the highest-paid actress in the United Kingdom, thanks to the colossal success of films like Come Play With Me, the line between her on-screen characters and her private reality was deliberately erased by her handlers. The men who controlled her career, particularly within the murky world of Soho's adult entertainment district, marketed her availability as part of the package. It was widely whispered that investors and influential figures were granted access to Mary as a perk of doing business, a practice that reduced the country's most popular starlet to a mere bargaining chip in high-stakes negotiations. Her life in London during this period was a whirlwind of flashbulbs and premieres, but beneath the surface, she was crumbling under the immense pressure to maintain the fantasy. The industry demanded that she be constantly on, projecting an image of carefree availability that contradicted her sensitive and fragile nature. While other actresses might have faced an awkward proposition in a producer's office and then gone home to safety, Mary lived within the machine that exploited her. The roles she received were written specifically to capitalize on her physical attributes, and she was often coerced into increasingly compromising scenes that she was uncomfortable with, told repeatedly that this was the price of her stardom and that she owed her success to the men who had discovered her. The relentless scrutiny from the authorities and the tabloid press added another layer of torment to her existence. In the late 70s, the British establishment began a crusade against the very industry Mary symbolized, and because she was the most visible figure, she became the primary target. Police raids and legal threats were constant, yet her producers continued to push her in front of the cameras, squeezing every ounce of profit from her notoriety while providing little emotional support. She was surrounded by people who claimed to love her, yet their affection seemed conditional on her ability to generate revenue and secure distribution deals through her charm and compliance. By the year 1979, the toll of living this dual life had become unbearable. Mary felt abandoned by the industry that had promised her the world, realizing that the casting couch mentality had stripped her of her autonomy and self-worth. Her final days were marked by a deep paranoia and a sense of hopelessness, a stark contrast to the beaming smile that had graced thousands of magazine covers. When she chose to leave this world just months before the end of the decade, it sent a shockwave through the nation, exposing the ruthless mechanisms of a business that could take a young girl from the countryside, promise her fame, and then systematically dismantle her spirit. Her story remains a cautionary tale of the 1970s, a decade that promised liberation, but, for women like Mary, often delivered only a more glamorous form of servitude. Fiona Richmond. If Mary Millington was the tragic victim of the industry, Fiona Richmond was the woman who boldly rode the tiger, yet her career remains the definitive example of how professional success in the 1970s was often entirely dependent on whom one shared a bed with. Fiona did not merely encounter the casting couch, she effectively moved into the penthouse of the man who owned the entire theatre. Her transformation from an unknown air stewardess to one of the most recognized faces in Britain was orchestrated by a single, powerful benefactor, Paul Raymond, the undisputed king of Soho. Their relationship was the worst-kept secret in London, a brazen arrangement where roles, fame, and luxury were explicitly exchanged for companionship and loyalty to a man who viewed women as the primary raw material of his empire. The dynamic between Fiona and Raymond was not a hidden affair, but a public statement of power. In the mid-70s, while other actresses struggled through humiliating auditions, Fiona was gifted starring roles in stage shows and feature films simply because she was the favorite of the man financing them. Productions such as Hardcore, released in 1977, were essentially vanity projects created to showcase Raymond's lover, blurring the lines between fiction and their private reality. The industry watched with a mixture of jealousy and disdain as she was chauffeured around London in a Jaguar E-Type emblazoned with her name, a gift that symbolized her status not just as a star, but as a possession of the most controversial figure in British entertainment. For Fiona, the price of this fast-tracked stardom was the total surrender of her identity. She became a brand extension of Raymond's publishing and theatre business, required to embody a persona of constant availability and scandalous liberation that sold magazines and tickets. The scripts she was given were often devoid of artistic merit, designed solely to capitalize on her relationship with Raymond and to titillate an audience that knew exactly how she had secured the part. She was trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by the finest champagne and the flashbulbs of the paparazzi, yet professionally, she was entirely tethered to the whims of one man. Had the relationship ended in those early years, her career would likely have evaporated instantly. A precarious position that forced her to navigate the volatile moods of a tycoon who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. Behind the scenes, the pressure to maintain this arrangement was immense. The 1970s were a decade of excess, and Fiona was expected to be the life of every party, the perfect hostess for Raymond's influential friends, and the glamorous face that legitimized his more sordid business dealings. It was a role that required an iron constitution and a detachment from the judgment of the traditional acting establishment, which sneered at her lack of formal training. Critics dismissed her as a creation rather than an actress, a label that stung despite the box office success of her films. She was the ultimate example of the patronage system, where talent was irrelevant compared to the favor of a wealthy protector. Yet, there is a complex sadness to her story as well. While she enjoyed a lifestyle that most working-class girls could only dream of, she was operating in a world dominated by predatory men who saw her only through the lens of her association with Raymond. Her agency was an illusion. Every interview she gave, every photograph taken, and every line she delivered was ultimately in service of her partner's bank balance. The roles she earned through her romance cemented her image as a sex symbol, a categorization that proved impossible to shake off later in life. Fiona Richmond's journey through the 1970s stands as a stark testament to the era's reality. For many women, the only way to bypass the gatekeepers was to become the gatekeeper's lover, a strategy that brought fame but demanded a piece of one's soul in return. Imogen Hassel. The story of Imogen Hassel is perhaps one of the most poignant examples of wasted potential in the British film industry of the 1970s, a heartbreaking narrative of a woman who was reduced to a caricature by the very men who claimed to adore her. Known in the press as the Countess of Cleavage, a nickname she loathed with every fiber of her being, Imogen was not a talentless starlet desperate for attention, but a classically trained actress from the prestigious Royal Shakespeare Company. She entered the profession with dreams of playing complex intellectual roles, but the male-dominated hierarchy of the 70s cinema had other plans. They saw only her physical beauty and her willingness to be daring, and they ruthlessly exploited these traits, forcing her into a corner where her professional survival often depended on her personal relationships with influential figures. Throughout the decade, Imogen found herself trapped on a glamorous treadmill, securing roles in films like Carry On Loving and various Hammer horror productions, not because of her dramatic range, but because she was viewed as the ultimate decorative object. To maintain her position in the spotlight, she was pressured to play the game of the London social scene, where casting decisions were frequently made at private parties rather than in audition rooms. It was an open secret that staying relevant meant being seen on the arm of the right man, and Imogen's love life became fodder for the tabloids, overshadowing her work. She drifted into relationships with high-profile actors and directors, hoping that these connections would finally yield the serious script she craved, but instead, they only cemented her status as a sex symbol, a commodity to be traded between productions. The cruelty of the casting couch in her case was psychological as well as physical. Producers would promise her substantial parts with dialogue and depth, only to strip away her lines and her clothing once the contracts were signed. She spoke in interviews of the deep humiliation she felt, describing how she was treated like a piece of meat by executives who would openly discuss her anatomy in front of her as if she were not in the room. Yet, she felt she had no choice but to smile and comply. To refuse was to disappear. The industry in the 1970s was unforgiving to women who demanded respect, and Imogen, despite her fierce ambition, found herself compromising her dignity time and again just to remain employed in the business she loved. As the 70s wore on, the strain of this dual existence began to take a visible toll. The constant rejection of her true talent, combined with the pressure to maintain an image of effortless glamour, led to a downward spiral. She was surrounded by industry insiders who were happy to share her company and her bed, but who vanished when she asked for genuine support or a role that did not require nudity. Her relationships, often volatile and public, were symptoms of a woman searching for stability in a world built on shifting sands. The directors who had once courted her began to look for the next new face, casting her aside with the same casual indifference with which they had discovered her. By the dawn of the 1980s, Imogen had become disillusioned and deeply sorrowful. The failure of her marriage and the drying up of film offers left her feeling abandoned by the system she had sacrificed so much for. She had played by their rules, used her beauty as currency, and engaged in the transactional relationships expected of her, yet she was left with nothing but a reputation she despised. Her tragic decision to leave this world at the tender age of 38 was a devastating indictment of an industry that devoured its young. Imogen Hassall wanted to be remembered as an artist. Instead, the 1970s machinery chewed her up, used her image to sell tickets, and left her broken. A stark reminder that the casting couch often takes far more than it gives. Carol White. Known to the public as the Battersea Bardot, Carol White was supposed to be the voice of a generation, a working-class girl who possessed a raw, undeniable talent that could move audiences to tears. However, her journey through the British film industry of the 1970s serves as a devastating example of how the casting couch culture could take a genuine artist and dismantle her piece by piece until nothing remained but a shadow. Unlike the glamour models who accepted the transactional nature of the business, Carol was a serious actress, celebrated for her gritty realism in Ken Loach's masterpieces. Yet, the moment she tasted success, the sharks of the industry began to circle, convinced that her blonde hair and vulnerable eyes were commodities to be sold to the highest bidder in the boardrooms of London and Hollywood. The transition from the 1960s to the 70s was a brutal awakening for Carol. The producers who controlled the purse strings were not interested in her dramatic range. They wanted a sex symbol who was compliant and available. It is widely acknowledged by those who knew her that Carol was thrust into a world where securing the next contract often meant navigating the sexual advances of the very men who claimed to be her mentors. She was encouraged to network in the most intimate of settings, with agents and studio heads making it clear that her continued ascent depended on her willingness to play the role of the starlet both on and off the screen. The pressure was relentless. She was surrounded by powerful figures who viewed her not as a colleague, but as a trophy to be passed around the upper echelons of the entertainment world. As her fame grew, so did the demands of the gentlemen's agreements that governed her career. She found herself caught in a transatlantic tug-of-war between London and Los Angeles, where the casting couch was an even more entrenched institution. In her search for stability and love, she often entered into relationships with industry heavyweights, hoping that a romantic connection would offer her protection from the predatory nature of the business. Tragically, the opposite was true. These relationships were often volatile and exploitative, with her partners using her fame to boost their own egos while simultaneously undermining her confidence. The roles she was offered in the 1970s became increasingly unworthy of her talent, focusing on her physical attributes rather than the emotional depth she had displayed in her early work. To cope with the immense stress of living in a world where her body was the primary currency, Carol began to rely on substances to numb the pain. The happy pills and liquid courage that were pressed into her hands at industry parties became a crutch, a way to survive the nights spent charming the men who held her future in their hands. The press, cruel and unforgiving, chronicled her erratic behavior without ever asking what had driven such a bright star to the edge. They labeled her difficult and unreliable, convenient tags that absolved the industry of any responsibility for her condition. Behind closed doors, however, The reality was that Carol was a woman exhausted by the constant need to barter for her place in the spotlight, worn down by a system that refused to let her be anything other than a disposable object of desire. By the end of the decade, the Battersea Bardot was virtually unrecognizable from the fresh-faced girl who had captivated the nation. Her career had stalled, not because she had lost her talent, but because she had been chewed up by the machinery of fame. The producers who had once clamored for her attention now ignored her calls, having moved on to the next young hope who was willing to pay the price of admission. Carol's story is a profound tragedy of the 1970s. She was a woman of immense potential who was sacrificed on the altar of the industry's greed. She learned too late that in the eyes of the movie moguls, a willingness to compromise one's morals was often valued far higher than the ability to act, a lesson that cost her everything. Barbara Windsor. The sound of her infectious giggle was the soundtrack to the 1970s for millions of Britons, a bubble of blonde effervescence that seemed to promise nothing but cheeky, harmless fun. Yet, the story of Barbara Windsor is not merely one of a national treasure entertaining the masses, but of a woman who had to navigate one of the most treacherous and predatory landscapes in the history of British entertainment. While she is remembered with affection today, the reality of her ascent in the film industry was inextricably linked to the dark, transactional nature of Soho and the powerful men who controlled it. Barbara was a woman who understood from a very young age that in a business run by gangsters and lecherous impresarios, her sexuality was the only weapon she possessed, and she used it with a calculating precision that ensured her survival where so many others vanished. Her involvement with the Carry On franchise, which reached its zenith in the 1970s, is often viewed through a lens of nostalgia, but the dynamics behind the scenes were far more complex and compromised. It was an open secret at Pinewood Studios that her position as the leading lady was secured not just by her undeniable comic timing, but by the intense, obsessive patronage of the franchise's biggest star, Sid James. James, a man much older and wielding immense influence over the casting process, became infatuated with Barbara to a degree that bordered on mania. While the public saw a hilarious on-screen partnership, the private reality was a pressurized environment where Barbara's continued presence in the films was heavily dependent on her managing the affections of the man who effectively acted as the gatekeeper. This was the ultimate manifestation of the casting couch in the 1970s. Not always a direct exchange with a producer, but a requirement to placate the male ego of the star who held the power of veto. Barbara found herself in a gilded trap, where rejecting the advances of the leading man could mean the end of her lucrative run in the country's most popular film series. She walked a precarious tightrope, engaging in a tumultuous affair with James that was driven as much by professional necessity as it was by any personal feeling. The industry insiders knew the score. For a woman to maintain her billing in such a male-dominated environment, she had to have a protector, and the price of that protection was often her body and her autonomy. Before she even reached the heights of the Carry On films, Barbara had been schooled in the brutal ways of the West End, a world where the line between show business and organized crime was virtually non-existent. Her early associations with the Cray twins and the club owners of London taught her that roles were rarely awarded on merit alone. She had to charm, flirt, and occasionally submit to the whims of the men who owned the venues and the contracts. In the 1970s, she carried this street-smart survival instinct into the film studios, presenting herself as the ditzy blonde while possessing a mind as sharp as a razor. She knew that the producers viewed her as a renewable resource, a pin-up to be exploited for box office receipts, and if she did not play the game by their rules, she would be replaced by the next willing starlet. The psychological toll of this constant performance was immense. Barbara was effectively forced to caricature herself, trapping a talented dramatic actress inside the body of a sex symbol to please the men who signed her checks. The scripts she was given in the 1970s became increasingly risque, pushing the boundaries of decency and requiring her to expose more of herself, a demand she met because she knew it was the currency of the time. She was fighting for her place in an industry that saw women as decorative props, and if sleeping with the right people or maintaining a close friendship with the star was what it took to stay on the poster, she was willing to pay that price. Her legacy is often sanitized, stripped of the grit and the grime that defined the era. However, to understand Barbara Windsor in the 1970s is to understand a woman who was constantly under siege, using her personal life as a bargaining chip in a high-stakes game of poker with the patriarchy. She may have been the queen of the carry-on team, but the crown was heavy, and it was bought with compromises that would have broken a weaker spirit. She did not just get roles, she fought for them in the boardrooms and the bedrooms of a business that was designed to use her up and spit her out, proving that behind the laughter lay a steely determination to survive at any cost. Angela Schuyler. She was the epitome of the upper-class, bubbly blonde who seemed to have the world at her feet after landing a coveted role as a Bond girl. Yet Angela Schuyler's tragic trajectory serves as a harrowing reminder of how the British film industry of the 1970s preyed upon the vulnerable. To the public, she was the picture of success, radiating a posh charm that made her a favorite in both high-profile dramas and the raucous sex comedies that defined the decade. However, behind the dazzling smile and the society parties lay a deeply troubled reality, where Angela was systematically exploited by a patriarchal system that viewed her not as a serious actress, but as a decorative asset to be used and discarded. Her journey was not one of gradual decline, but a forced descent, orchestrated by producers and agents who understood that her fragility could be manipulated for their own gain. Following her appearance in On Her Majesty's Secret Service at the turn of the decade, Angela should have been destined for greatness. Instead, she found herself trapped in the murky waters of the British exploitation boom, cast in films like Adventures of a Taxi Driver and Adventures of a Private Eye. These roles were not choices made from artistic ambition, but were the result of a coercive industry culture where maintaining one's status often required submitting to the demands of powerful men. It was widely whispered in the corridors of Pinewood and Elstree that for a girl like Angela to keep working, she had to be accommodating to the financiers who funded these low-budget productions. The casting couch was not a myth to her. It was the turnstile she had to pass through to access the set, a humiliating ritual that stripped away her self-worth piece by piece. The 1970s were a confusing time for actresses who wanted to be taken seriously. The industry was shrinking, and the few roles available were largely controlled by a small clique of impresarios who operated with little regard for professional ethics. Angela, with her sensitive nature and deep-seated insecurities, was ill-equipped to handle the sharks who circled her. She was often pushed into situations where the lines between a professional meeting and a romantic rendezvous were deliberately blurred. Stories from the era suggest that she was frequently paraded at dinners and private gatherings as a trophy, her presence serving as a sweetener for business deals between men who saw women as interchangeable commodities. This constant objectification took a severe toll on her mental well-being, fostering a deep sense of inadequacy that plagued her throughout her life. Her personal life became inextricably linked with her professional survival. She entered into relationships with older, established figures in the theater and film world, perhaps seeking a protector who could shield her from the worst excesses of the business. However, even these relationships were often fraught with the power dynamics of the industry. The pressure to remain the eternal, youthful ingenue in a decade that was rapidly changing was suffocating. As the 1970s wore on, the dolly bird image she had been forced to cultivate began to feel like a prison. The producers who had once courted her with champagne and promises began to lose interest as she aged, replacing her with fresh faces who were yet to be broken by the system. This rejection was not just professional, it was a personal devastation for a woman who had been taught that her value lay entirely in her ability to attract men. The dark clouds that gathered over Angela's life were a direct result of the trauma she accumulated during those years. She struggled privately with severe internal battles, fighting against an image she loathed but could not escape. The industry had taken a talented, bright young woman and reduced her to a stereotype, forcing her to trade pieces of her soul to remain relevant. Her story is one of the most heartbreaking of the era because it highlights the cruelty of a business that demanded total submission. When she eventually chose to leave this world years later, it was the final tragic chapter of a story written in the 1970s, a decade where the casting couch claimed not just careers, but lives. Angela Schuyler remains a symbol of the lost potential of a generation, a victim of a ruthless machine that cared more for box office receipts than for the human beings it destroyed. Susan George. The 1970s produced no starlet quite as controversial or as coveted as Susan George. With her honey blonde hair, pouty lips, and an air of innocent corruption, she was the ultimate fantasy of every male director in Britain and Hollywood. Yet her rise to global fame was not merely a case of a lucky break. It was the result of a harrowing journey through an industry that demanded women surrender their boundaries to secure a place on the poster. While the public saw a confident sex symbol, the reality behind the scenes was a disturbing narrative of psychological manipulation and coerced vulnerability. Susan became the face of a new kind of cinema that blended violence with eroticism, but the path to those roles was paved with intimate auditions and private dinners where the menu often included the expectation of total submission to the whims of powerful men. Her defining moment came with the 1971 release of the controversial masterpiece Straw Dogs, a film that would forever associate her name with one of the most brutal scenes in cinema history. However, the story of how she secured the role of Amy Sumner is shrouded in the dark folklore of the casting couch era. It is widely whispered in industry circles that the director, Sam Peckinpah, a man known for his volatile temper and misogynistic streak, put young actresses through a gauntlet of humiliation to test their suitability for the part. For Susan, barely out of her teens, this meant navigating a terrifying power dynamic where her ability to act was secondary to her willingness to expose herself, both emotionally and physically, to a man who held her future in his hands. The casting process for such high-profile films in the 1970s was rarely conducted in a sterile office. Instead, it took place in hotel suites and private clubs, where the lines between professional interest and predatory behavior were deliberately blurred. Susan was thrust into a world where she was expected to charm, flirt, and prove her lack of inhibition to men old enough to be her father. The industry viewed her youth not as something to protect, but as a commodity to be exploited for box office returns. By agreeing to play the game, she secured the role that made her a star, but she also signed a silent contract that allowed the media and the moguls to treat her as public property. The price of her admission to the A-list was the stripping away of her privacy, as she was marketed purely on her sexual availability rather than her significant dramatic talent. Throughout the decade, Susan found herself trapped in a cycle where the only scripts she received were those that required nudity and compromised situations. The gentlemen's agreements that operated in London and Hollywood meant that her reputation preceded her. Producers assumed that because she had played daring roles, she was game for anything off-screen as well. This assumption led to uncomfortable encounters with financiers and studio heads who felt entitled to her time and affection as a perk of their investment. She was surrounded by a court of admirers who claimed to want to help her career, yet their assistance always seemed to come with a heavy caveat attached. The psychological toll of constantly having to fend off advances while trying to maintain a professional demeanor was exhausting, leading to a life lived in a state of high anxiety. What makes Susan George's story so poignant is that she was a genuinely gifted actress, capable of nuanced and heartbreaking performances, yet the 1970s industry was not interested in her mind. They wanted the sexy victim, a trope she was forced to embody again and again. The directors who hired her often bragged about breaking her, a grotesque terminology that referred to shattering her reserves to get the raw, terrified reaction they wanted on film. She was a woman operating in a war zone disguised as a playground, where the only way to survive was to develop a thick skin and learn how to manipulate the men who were trying to manipulate her. By the end of the decade, Susan had achieved the fame she dreamt of, but it was a victory that tasted of ash. She had navigated the treacherous waters of the casting couch and emerged as an icon, but the industry had taken its pound of flesh. Her legacy in the 1970s is a testament to the resilience of a young woman who walked into the lion's den and survived, but it also serves as a damning indictment of a culture that forced its brightest stars to barter their dignity for a chance to shine. She remains a symbol of the era's dark bargain. Fame and fortune were available, but only to those willing to leave a piece of themselves behind in the producer's office. Lynn Frederick. The tragic tale of Lynn Frederick is perhaps the most devastating example of how the British film industry of the 1970s consumed its young, wrapping a narrative of fairy tale romance around a core of deep exploitation. To the public, Lynn was the ultimate English rose, a woman of porcelain beauty and gentle grace who had captured the heart of the nation's biggest comedy star, Peter Sellers. However, her journey was not one of earned success, but of a career entirely dictated by the whims of a man who wielded his power like a weapon. Unlike actresses who had to navigate the casting couch with multiple producers, Lin found herself trapped in a gilded cage where her professional survival was inextricably linked to her marriage. She did not merely visit the casting couch, she married the man who owned the studio, and the price she paid for her roles was her youth, her autonomy, and ultimately, her life. When Lin entered the industry in the early 70s, she was a bright and promising talent, delivering nuanced performances in films like Nicholas and Alexandra and Henry VIII and His Six Wives. She possessed a classical ability that could have seen her become a dame of the theater, yet the predatory nature of the business steered her towards a different path. Her fateful meeting with Peter Sellers in the mid-70s changed everything. Sellers, decades her senior and notorious for his volatile and controlling personality, saw in Lin not just a wife, but a possession, a doll to be molded and displayed. The industry watched with cynical amusement as this young girl was swept up by the chaotic force of nature that was Sellers, whispering that she had secured the ultimate role through the bedroom door. The dynamic of their relationship was a dark reflection of the era's gender politics. Sellers, insecure and possessive, effectively appointed himself as the gatekeeper of her career. He decided which films she could accept and which she must refuse, often sabotaging opportunities that would have taken her away from his side. In return for her compliance and her devotion to his fragile ego, he leveraged his immense clout to force studios to cast her in his own projects. The most infamous example occurred in 1979 with The Prisoner of Zenda. It was an open secret on set that Lin's role was a condition of Sellers' participation, a classic case of nepotism that drew the ire of critics and colleagues alike. She was paraded on screen not because she was right for the part, but because she was the star's wife, a situation that humiliated her and undermined her professional credibility. Behind the closed doors of their luxury homes, the reality was far removed from the glamour of the red carpet. Lin was living in a pressure cooker, tasked with managing the manic highs and depressive lows of a genius who was often cruel and manipulative. The industry, rather than offering her support, viewed her as a gold digger who had traded her body for access to the A-list. This perception was unfair and misogynistic, ignoring the fact that she was a victim of grooming by a man with vastly more power and experience. The producers who fawned over her at premieres were the same men who sneered at her talent behind her back, seeing her only as an extension of Sellers' brand. She was trapped in a role she could not escape, forced to play the doting wife to maintain her position in a world that otherwise would have discarded her. The tragedy of her situation deepened as the decade drew to a close. Lin was isolated from her peers, her confidence eroded by a husband who demanded total submission. When she did try to assert her independence, the emotional blackmail was severe. She was living the ultimate casting couch nightmare, the realization that her big break was actually a life sentence of servitude to a powerful man. The roles she received through this connection brought her no joy, only scrutiny and derision. She was effectively blacklisted by the serious filmmaking community, who saw her as Sellers' baggage rather than an actress in her own right. The potential she had shown in the early 70s had been suffocated by the very mechanism that was supposed to elevate her. After Sellers passed away at the dawn of the 1980s, the industry turned on Lin with ferocious cruelty. The protection his name had offered evaporated overnight, leaving her exposed to the vitriol of the press and the public. She was branded a Black Widow, stripped of her reputation and left to navigate the wreckage of her life alone. The trauma of those years in the 70s, where she had been used as a pawn in the high-stakes games of show business, led her down a dark path of self-medication. She struggled with substances as she tried to numb the pain of a career that had been stolen from her. Lynn Frederick's story stands as a somber warning from the 1970s. She was a woman who gave everything to the industry, only to find that the price of admission was her soul, leaving her broken long before her time. Britt Ekland. Few faces defined the visual landscape of the 1970s quite like Britt Ekland, a woman whose stunning Nordic beauty made her one of the most photographed stars in Britain. However, her journey through the film industry serves as the ultimate case study of how female celebrity in that era was often constructed, controlled, and consumed by powerful men. While she was undoubtedly talented, her ascent to the A-list was not achieved through traditional auditions, but was inextricably linked to her high-profile romantic entanglements with the gods of the entertainment world. Her career began in earnest when she was effectively handpicked by Peter Sellers, the most powerful actor in Britain at the time, who saw her photograph in a newspaper and decided he must possess her. Their whirlwind marriage was less of a partnership and more of an acquisition, catapulting her onto the screen but trapping her in a dynamic where her professional opportunities were dictated by her husband's mood and influence. Throughout the 1970s, Brit was forced to navigate an industry that refused to see her as anything other than a decorative accessory to a powerful male figure. Even after her divorce from Sellers, the shadow of the patronage system loomed large over her career. Producers viewed her as a trophy, and casting her in a film was often a cynical move to capitalize on her turbulent private life rather than her acting ability. In the corridors of British studios, it was an open secret that Brit was a package deal, and securing her for a role often meant navigating the complex web of her personal relationships. She was surrounded by industry moguls who felt entitled to comment on her body and her love life in the boardroom, treating her existence as a marketing tool for their productions. The roles she was offered, the gangster's mole in Get Carter or the Bond girl in The Man with the Golden Gun, were iconic, yet they reinforced the idea that her primary function was to be looked at, not heard. The most egregious example of the industry's exploitation of Brit occurred during the making of the cult classic The Wicker Man in 1973. The producers and the director, men who held total control over the final cut, engaged in a deception that would haunt her for decades. Brit had a strict clause in her contract regarding nudity, wishing to maintain some control over her own image. However, the filmmakers, believing that the audience and the box office demanded more flesh, secretly hired a body double from a strip club to perform the more explicit scenes. They then edited this footage seamlessly into the film, leading the world to believe that Brit had bared all. When she discovered the betrayal, she was devastated, realizing that her consent had been overruled by a group of men who believed their artistic vision and commercial greed justified the violation of her autonomy. This incident was emblematic of her entire experience in the 1970s, a constant battle to assert her own identity in a business designed to strip it away. She was the ultimate it girl, dating rock stars like Rod Stewart and attending the most exclusive parties in London. But behind the glamour was a woman fighting for respect in a boys' club. The producers who fawned over her at premieres were the same men who would casually discuss her anatomy in production meetings, debating how much of her they could sell to the public. Her value was calculated in column inches and sex appeal, and whenever she tried to break free from this mold, the industry pushed back, reminding her that her stardom was conditional on her playing the role they had assigned her. By the end of the decade, Brit Eklund had survived the Shark Tank, but the scars of the era were evident. She had been married to a genius who tormented her, tricked by producers who exploited her, and fetishized by a media that cared only for who she was sleeping with. Her story is a powerful conclusion to our list because it highlights that even the most famous and beautiful women in the world were not safe from the predatory nature of the casting couch culture. In the 1970s, the film industry was a machine that ran on the exploitation of women, and Brit Eklund, for all her fame, was just another cog in that ruthless wheel, forced to trade her privacy and her dignity to remain in the spotlight that the men controlled.